Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shannon Tiezi, and I am the editor-in-chief at The Diplomat magazine, and this is another edition of The Diplomat's webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about Maldives' presidential election, what it means for the country, what it means for foreign policy, and what it means for geopolitics in the Indian Ocean region. So as people joining this webinar probably know, Maldives has a new president-elect as of September 30th. And it is the opposition candidate, Mohamed Muizzu, who handily defeated incumbent President Ibrahim Solih. So we have a change coming, and I'm very eager to discuss with our panelists what this means for Maldives politics, the economy, and of course, the foreign policy implications, particularly for India and China. So joining us today, we have Mimrah Ghafoor, who is a columnist for The Diplomat, covering politics and diplomacy of the Indian Ocean with a particular focus on Maldives. And he previously served as the lead speechwriter at the office of the president of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. And he has previously worked in Maldives' president's office and foreign ministry. We are also joined by JJ Robinson, who is a senior program officer at the Open Society Foundation's program on independent journalism in London. But he was formerly the editor of Maldives' first independent news service, Minivan News, and is the author of Maldives Islamic Republic, Tropical Autocracy. So thank you both for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be able to talk with you about all the implications of this important election in Maldives. Mimrah, I would like to start with you. Can you just give us a brief overview of what were the main political stories leading up to this election? How should we interpret the result, and what does this mean for Maldives politics going forward?
Sure. Thank you, Shannon. So just to reiterate the context, the key takeaway is that the incumbent government has lost. So Solih, who lost with 46% of the vote compared to 54% of the vote by Mohamed Muizzu. This election was very much the MDP's to lose. And there's a few reasons why this happened. In 2018, they had actually won with a very sizable mandate. If I recall the numbers correctly, Solih, who had won 60% of the vote in that election, and they subsequently secured a supermajority in parliament. So just the diminishing popularity of the Solih administration had been very much a factor in this election. There's a few reasons for why the government's political standing had diminished so much in the lead up to the election. First of all, there's been a split within the ruling MDP. There is a faction loyal to the Speaker of Parliament, former President Mohamed Nasheed, and a faction, the majority faction, loyal to the ruling party, the MDP. Now, partisans of Mohamed Nasheed, they had actually formed a separate political party called the Democrats, and they have essentially been a factor in damaging the political standing of the president. A second factor is that the government has not been very effective in responding to an India Out campaign led by the opposition. So the opposition led by the PNC PPM coalition, they have essentially been putting forth this argument that this government is far too reliant on India through its India First foreign policy, and that they are amenable to hosting an Indian military presence in the form of Indian personnel that manage our two aircraft leased to the Maldives that carry out search and rescue operations and disaster relief operations. And also they've helped us build a dockyard in the island of Uttarutilafal, which the opposition are claiming is essentially an Indian military base. A third factor has been a general discontent towards the Solih administration for not really being able to fulfill its inaugural pledges. As I mentioned, in 2018, when Solih was elected, he was elected with a very strong mandate. And part of that mandate was an anti-corruption mandate. because after a number of corruption scandals and money laundering scandals that surfaced under the Yamin administration, citizens had decided that they wanted enough and they wanted a new administration. And in fact, uh, the word Solihu administration in Divehi, it's sort of a play on words because Solihu means righteous and transparent. And they were essentially positing themselves or presenting themselves as an administration that would deal with that. Subsequently, however, there's been a lot of corruption scandals under this administration as well, which has really made the government take a hit. And thirdly, I don't believe that the government's campaign was particularly effective this time around. The president had not been as visible in the campaign trail, especially in the capital, as he should have been. And beyond the MDP split, there were a lot of things that the MDP did wrong. First, they had essentially banked on relying on the same coalition partners that had brought them to power in 2018. These coalition partners being the Jamhuri Party led by Qasim Ibrahim and the Maldives Reform Movement that's associated with former President Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, sticking with them and carrying them to victory during this election. However, not only did this coalition not stick with the president during the election, they had disintegrated by the eve of the election. Not only that, they essentially did not really secure many votes anyway. I think collectively they scored less than 5-6% of the popular vote. So essentially, it's been a 5-year miscalculation that has played out. And then returning to our new president-elect, Mohamed Muizzu, that's also, there's an important context there in the sense that for a long time, the PPM had been presenting Yamin Abdul Gayoom as their candidate for this election. And Mohamed Muizzu became a stand-in for Yamin at the 11th hour. So he essentially represents the PNC half of the PPM, PNC half of the PNC PPM coalition, both of which are aligned with Yamin Abdul Gayoom. And this selection was initially made at the request of Yamin Abdul Gayoom, who had requested that an alternative candidate to him be put forward by this coalition in the event that he would not be able to contest. And the reason that he had worried that he would not, he correctly worried that he would not have been able to contest is because he's serving an 11-year sentence for money laundering right now. And subsequently, our Elections Commission and our Supreme Court ruled that because of that conviction, he's ineligible to contest. So Muizz became a candidate at the 11th hour, and he has essentially gone on to win the presidency. He is currently our president-elect. Going forward, he faces quite a bit of challenges. Even though he's become the president-elect, the MDP, they still control parliament, a majority, even with the Nasheed Solih who split. And just as Solih had to deal with the factor of Nasheed, Muizzu will very likely have to deal with the factor of Yamin looming in the background and sort of trying to be the power behind the power. So he has a very difficult road ahead. I think I'll leave it there just for the sake of brevity, but I hope that's a sufficient overview for now.
Yes, thank you, Mimrah. We're going to have plenty of time to dig into these issues in more detail in the Q&A, so I look forward to that. But that's a great overview of how we got to now. JJ, I'm hoping we can ask you to help us take a step back and look at this in the broader context of Maldives' democratic transition. It's a young democracy, and there have been some ups and downs, to put it mildly. So What does this election tell us about Maldives' democratic health, and what can we expect on that front moving forward?
I think one thing to keep in mind, and Mimrah, do correct me if I'm wrong here, but as far as I'm aware, an incumbent has never won an election in the Maldives since multi-party democracy was introduced in 2008, and that introduction came on the back of civil unrest. It replaced a 30-plus year autocracy under Malmoun Abdul, who's the half-brother of Abdul Yamin, the former president from who took over after the 2012 coup. So Maldives democratic transition, it's, I would say, almost a cycle at this point. You had this 2008 opening of the country with the new constitution, freedom of expression in a way that hadn't existed before, newly opened rights such as being able to travel to islands. It was a much less restrictive environment than it had been previously. But at the same time, you had all of these new parties, all these political interests. The sort of Maldivian Democratic Party at the time segued from being a party of activists into political leaders. They came in with the support of this coalition of small interests of businessmen and religious figures who all turned on the former president. So this pattern of an opposition figure or an opposition majority joining forces with all of these elements that are dissatisfied with the ruling government and managing to topple them, usually in a runoff election, is pretty much the sort of pattern of the last few elections. So with the MDP, you had this period of about 3-4 years of fairly open liberalization from 2008. The countries became famous for the underwater cabinet meeting. Nasheed represented it on sort of international stage and climate events, being a very sort of outspoken and charismatic person. Fast forward to 2012, there's the former regime thunders back into power on the back of the police and military-led mutiny. And at that time, there's not that much diplomatic interest in the Maldives. India has an embassy there. There's most of the sort of diplomatic presence from the West is dealing with tourists who drop their passports in the sea. There's not that much of an interest beyond the sort of tourism resort politics. So if you look beyond that now, we have this sort of great power thing going on with India versus China. Under Yamin, when the Yamin came into power, he really was able to, there was a loss of that sort of Western support, that Western interest, and Saudi Arabia and India became the sort of Saudi Arabia and China became donors of sort of last resort. And Yamin consolidated this up until 2013 during the in the 2013 election under Mohamed Muizzu, Yamin was able to sort of come to power, and that was a very sort of dark patch in the Maldives history. There was a lot of gang violence, a merger between the gangs and these sort of rising power of religious extremism started to come in. This crossover between politics, religious violence, and gangs, especially within Mali, became a significant factor. Journalists were killed, people were disappeared. The general climate in the country soured, and so when the election came around again in 2018, it was a real surprise that the MDP were able to win at all, given a lot of the sort of given the sort of long-winded, long sort of state corruption of some of the political institutions. And we can talk a little bit about that later, in sort of the role of the judiciary and all this, which I think has been central to the Maldives democratic story so far.
Thank you, JJ. That's a good scene setter for our discussion. But I think we do need to talk a little bit now about the geopolitics of it. In foreign media coverage, there's a tendency to frame the election result not as Muizzu versus Solih, but China versus India. And there is a sense that China won this election and India lost. And I know, Mimrah, you've written for us about how limiting that framework is in understanding Maldivian politics. So maybe we can start with you to talk a little bit about, does that framing make sense? And what does this actually mean for Maldives foreign policy going forward?
It makes sense, but it's also very much overemphasized, because the Maldives is not really a country that's really in a position where we can starkly choose between India and China, to the point where this binary is very simplistic. And part of the issue is not, I can't blame it all on international coverage. It's a narrative that's employed by our local politicians as well. As I've mentioned, the PPM and PNC, they had staked their comeback very much on an India out campaign. So they generally were trying to mobilize an antipathy towards India, or fear that we are becoming overly subservient to India, as leverage at the ballot box. And it is true that under the Yamin administration, the last PPM administration, that we did develop fairly robust commercial and strategic, more commercial ties with China. But there's a broader context that really needs to be emphasized here. People forget that even Abdullah Yamin, he maintained an India first foreign policy. And in fact, when he came to power, when he was elected in 2013, the Maldives-India bilateral relationship had become a bit strained, because his predecessor, Wahid, who took over after the coup against Nasheed, he had expelled an Indian conglomerate, GMR, that were tasked with developing our airport. And Yamin actually exerted quite a lot of effort to try and rectify that. He made India his first state visit. He recommitted and reiterated that commitment to an India first foreign policy several times over. He, in fact, implored our media not to engage in overly hostile or defamatory reporting against India, simply because, just by virtue of proximity, we're so reliant on India, whether for imports, whether for emergency aid, and even once for military assistance. Yamin's half-brother in 1988, he was threatened with a coup organized by local political discontents with the aid of Sri Lankan mercenaries. When he turned to the international community for assistance, he turned to the US, he turned to the UK, and they just told him turn to India. And India was the only one who responded, and they were able to rescue his administration. During the Yamin administration in 2014, we had a water crisis where there was a problem with a desalinization plant in the capital, and we had lack of access to drinking water, and India airlifting supplies to us really helped us rectify that crisis. His turn to China also needs to be set in a broader context, that Yamin came to power in 2013. That's the same year that Xi Jinping launched his Belt and Road Initiative. And 2 years prior to that, the Maldives, in 2011, we had graduated from least developed country status, meaning that we were no longer eligible for official development assistance. So we actually needed to turn to bilateral partners for infrastructure support and other kinds of commercial projects. So it was in that context that he started engaging with China more. In terms of when his relationship with India really started deteriorating, it was mostly towards the end of his term. His political standing at that point was very weak, because he had lost a majority in parliament, and the Supreme Court had issued a ruling essentially ordering him to release all the political prisoners that he was keeping imprisoned. And sort of to salvage his political standing, he started he started with this nationalist anti-India rhetoric. We're going to get rid of these aircraft from India, which we've been happy to have all this time. And he and similarly with the India Out campaign, it's mostly been about mobilizing domestic voters. And the converse should be highlighted as well. So when the MDP were in opposition, they were very, very skeptical of the kind of commercial relationship that we had with China. They were constantly reiterating that we could fall into a debt trap similar to other countries, maybe Sri Lanka. But once they were in power, they've been very happy to take commercial cooperation with China forward. The only main discrepancy between this administration and the last is that this administration has not been willing to enter into a free trade agreement with China. So going forward, I think just if past is prologue, there's a chance. In fact, there's not a chance. Muizzu himself has softened his India out rhetoric. In fact, he's recommitted the Maldives to maintaining an India first foreign policy. And while he has spoken about removing an Indian military presence, etc., I think these are mostly essentially targeted to his base. Once he actually takes over the presidency and the responsibilities of governance replace the responsibilities of campaigning, I think the rhetoric will be very different. So while we can expect that India will not perhaps react very favorably at the outset of this administration, which was brought to power on the back of an India Out campaign, I think eventually, as I said, that our rhetoric towards India will soften. And I think India is also in a position where it realizes that PPM is one of the largest parties in the country. They can't just bank on the MDP being in power all the time. So if they really want to engage with the country, they need to be able to have a robust relationship with the PPM as well. So just with that context in mind, I think it's important that the binary between China and India is not as stark as the international community is making it out to be, and not as stark as even our local politicians are making it out to be.
Thank you, Mimrah. There's a lot of food for thought there. One thing that I'd like to tease out a little bit more is, are there going to be political consequences for the government having run on this India Out campaign and, you know, fired up all of this anti-Indian nationalism? If they then try and backpedal and soften, could that create problems for them in the future? And JJ, maybe you can chime in on what the domestic politics of foreign policy are going to, which directions they're going to pull the government.
Well, in a sense, the Maldives has a history of remaining quite neutral, or at the very least playing all sides off against one another quite well to its benefit. For instance, a sort of threat of with climate change, a lot of money flowed in from the West in sort of support of Maldivian development projects. With this election, I mean, the problem is, as Mimrah has said, a lot of this aid money that flowed in has now been replaced by bilateral support. One of the biggest, I'd say, behind the scenes threats the Maldives faces at the moment is this incredible amount of public debt it has just in keeping its government going. I mean, and this very much continued under Solih's administration. Debt between 2018 and 21 doubled. It's now about 115% of GDP, which is very high for a small country like this. It's complicated further by the fact that the Maldives is, as an import-dependent country, both for food, for oil. Oil sustains your desalinators, so oil means water. It sustains the transport between the islands, these sort of 200 scattered local islands that sort of rely a lot on this inter-island transport. That's marine diesel, as well as running the resorts, shipping tourists around, running these sort of quite sort of expensive generators on every single island, because there just isn't really power infrastructure. Everything has to be done separately on each island. So in that sense, it's a very import dependent economy. And when you have any kind of shock to foreign exchange, such as a pandemic, for instance, then, or anything that cuts off that or hurts that tourism supply that brings in foreign currency to the country, it sends ripples through the Maldives' ability to operate. So one of the frightening figures I think that came out last year was that at one point the Maldives was down to 6 weeks of foreign exchange supply, which again, if this is your food, if this is your water, this is why the Maldives is so dependent on its neighbors, and maintaining this enough goodwill for people to continue being willing to loan money to it as it gets on its feet. So this kind of political instability, I would say you can view this also through the lens of the radicalization of the country and the sort of risks that poses to tourism potentially. These are sort of, this currency question is an existential problem for the Maldives, and so this is how I would view the relationship with these larger countries, as opposed to something of strategic interest either.
Yeah, thank you. I think now we're going to pop into our audience Q&A. We already have some good questions there. I would encourage everyone listening, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. But we will start with one from the Diplomat's own Sudha Ramachandran. She asks, what role have the Islamists played in this election? And I think that's a good reminder. We haven't talked about Islamic politics, political parties yet in this discussion. But it's been a big issue in Maldives in the past. So how did that factor in this time around? Mimrah, maybe we can start with you again.
Well, actually, there was a lot of anti-campaigning towards Islamists this time, more than a mobilized Islamist base. There's this, the Maldives, we do have a problem where there's this gang and religious extremism nexus. But at the same time, people should remember that parties that have been ultra-conservative do extremely poorly in our elections. For instance, the current government maintains the Abdul as a coalition partner. And they've historically been our religiously conservative party. They won 2 seats in parliament during the 2014, during the last parliamentary cycle, and they won no seats during this cycle. So a lot of the Islamist factor in the Maldives, they were essentially, there was a lot of anti-campaigning towards Muizzu by the MDP, who highlight his connections through his in-laws with this organization called Jamiatul Salaf, which are a religiously conservative organization in the Maldives. However, Muizzu himself has said that he has no formal associations with them, and that, in fact, he, as a member of the former Adawat party, he left the he left that party because he didn't necessarily agree with their worldview. So in terms of political mobilization, there's a fear factor that's perhaps overstated, but at the same time, they do present a sort of a social nuisance and a sort of a dangerous social element. As people will recall, in May 2021, there was an assassination attempt against former President Mohamed Nasheed, which almost succeeded. They detonated a remote explosive device as he was on his path to his motorcade. And in the past, we've had tourists stabbed in the capital. We've had a few stabbings that have been claimed by extremist groups. But in terms of voting mobilization, they have not really been a very significant factor, especially not extremist organizations, which typically have the view that democracy is something that's perhaps not Islamic. Having said that, religion as a whole does play a huge role in Maldivian politics. We are a country that where religious identity and our national identity are extremely intertwined. So any candidate who doesn't respect that or play to that, they're not going to be able to do well politically. But if we're defining Islamists as people who want to impose a very fundamental, a very restrictive version of the religion on the country, they have not really been a significant political factor.
Thank you, Mimrah. JJ, did you want to chime in on this as well?
Sure. I mean, we can absolutely separate the sort of electoral political impact of the Islamic Party Adalah and the sort of overall political impact of religion in the Maldives, which I would say is quite high. One comment after the election from a Maldivian friend was that he didn't know a single Maldivian who drinks who voted for the MDP or didn't spoil their ballot. There was a real backlash against, I would say, reflected in perhaps lower election turnout, and a record high number of spoiled ballots in the election from people who were very dissatisfied with the way Solih's party handled some of the or failed to handle some of the issues with Islamic extremism in the country. And one of the factors for Nasheed splintering off and creating this new party was the MDP's initial entertainment, but then rejection on the suggestion of the Adalah scholars to make calling someone anti-Islamic or un-Islamic a hate crime. And so this was one of the sort of throughout hundreds of years of Maldivian history, painting your political opponents as being irreligious or un-Islamic has been a way to publicly discredit them. With the rise of Wahhabism and this the introduction of this new, very sort of non-Maldivian practice of Islam since about 2004 with the tsunami, this wave of sort of Saudi Arab version of it, that supplanted the traditional Maldivian practice of Islam that was quite relaxed. This sort of has increased the stakes. Calling someone un-Islamic on public social media is something that represents a physical threat to that person, potentially in the street, given that you have these violent Salafi gangs. If enough of them agree, they'll go after you. And this is what happened with some of these journalists who never professed themselves to be anything other than Islamic, but stood up and called for things like religious tolerance, or were simply in the headlights of these groups. So the stakes for being called for being sort of for using this as a political tool in the Maldives have increased significantly. So the MDP's failure to get to grips with that, and to be fair, it's a very difficult position to put them in when your political opponents can paint that any attempt to tackle the Islamists as a something that's anti-Maldivian, because you have that distinction between a lack of distinction between being Maldivian and being Islamic. The nationalism and the religious factor is completely intertwined. So it's very easy to turn any of that into an attack on the country. In the longer term, I think it's going to be more a factor for the tourism industry. If you look a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, the US Treasury released a list of sanctioned Maldivian companies and individuals who are tied up with al-Nusra and al-Qaeda. And it was, I mean, this was something that had been thrown around for a long time as in sort of, people sort of had talked about it, but seeing that list and the number of companies on it that would potentially linked to tourism interests, it was definitely something the country has to get to at some point if it wants to continue to maintain this Western-oriented tourism resort industry.
Yeah, and I think that was a key point in your book, the discrepancy between those two, the tourist paradise, Islamic Republic. I'm going to take another question from our audience, from Rishab Yadav. One of the reasons for Solih and Nasheed's fight was the power tussle within the MDP. In this context, how do you see the power tussle being played out between Yameen and Muizzu on one hand and PPM-PNC on the other hand, since Muizzu now represents the PNC? Could this again bring political instability, and could we see the formation of new alliances? Great question. As you mentioned in your remarks, Mimrah, the tension between Yameen, who is not the president, and Muizzu, who is the president, could be significant. So can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yes, and yes is my answer to the question as well. I think these dynamics do portend some political instability, because Yameen Abdul is not a happy man right now. And just on the point of the PNC, which Muizzu is in fact now the president of, there's some important context I'd like to put forward. So Yameen has typically been associated with the PPM, the Progressive Party of Maldives. He created the PNC sort of to hedge his bets in case that he lost control of the PPM. So he wanted to create a party, the People's National Congress, that he would have total control over. And that is obviously not the case right now, with the president-elect having very recently, I think it was just yesterday or the day before yesterday, he has formally made himself the leader of the PNC. I think there will be some tensions in terms of who they pick to be in the cabinet. There'll also be tensions between who they will support in the upcoming parliamentary elections in March next year. And there's a lot of potential for fluid alliances. Just to give a parallel, one of the key points of contention between President Solih and former President Nasheed, who is now Speaker of Parliament, is that Nasheed essentially wants to become the head of government through a legislative route. He wants to take forward a referendum on transition in the country from a presidential to a parliamentary system. And he has calculated that Yameen is someone who might actually support him in this bid. And while Yameen and Mohamed Nasheed make for very strange bedfellows, they've had each other thrown in prison in the past. There's no love lost between them, but their interest might align in the sense that Yameen is someone who, on the record, does support a parliamentary form of government, and it might present a plausible route for him back to power if he, for instance, decides to contest in the legislature next year, and him and Nasheed could be leading the charge to have that referendum. And in terms of the split between Yameen and Muizzu, I think there's a chance that the split will occur a lot earlier than did occur between Solih and Nasheed, who did maintain Solih was happy to be elected on the name recognition of Nasheed, who had for a long time been the face of the MDP, if not our overall democracy movement. But they parted ways around 2021, and that parting of ways became especially entrenched after Nasheed challenged Solihu in the MDP primaries in January this year. But there was a 2-year grace period. But Yamin is a politically savvy man. He will look at he will look at these comparisons. He will look at what happened to Nasheed and how he lost control over his party to Solihu and other figures more powerful within the MDP than they used to be, such as the MDP chairperson currently, the economic minister Fayaz Ismail. Yamin might look at that and say, this is not something that I want to happen to me. I want to make my move at the very outset and insist on my control, because for a lot during the campaign season, every billboard of Muizzu plastered across the country has Yamin right next to him in a very prominent position. The message clearly being that, okay, my name is Mohamed Muizzu, but if you vote for me, you're voting for a Yamin administration, and I will facilitate a path for him back to power if you elect me. And Solihu did the same thing with Nasheed. And I don't think that's I don't think that's a dynamic that Yamin will want to see repeated. So yes, to put it short and sweet, there will be tension between the two.
All right, JJ, how do you see Yamin's role in this administration going forward?
As a character, Yamin, I think you can argue quite convincingly as someone who, let's put it generously, understands the role of fear in maintaining political control. And while he was in power last time, there was very little distinction between the sort of what constituted a member of a gang and what constituted a PPM political activist. Wielding the gangs for political power is something that many political factions in the Maldives have done. It's quite well documented in the report by the Asia Foundation about 5 or 6 years ago, with the price list of all the different services, from breaking a window to busting up a political rally. But Yamin and his deputy minister, Ahmed Adib, really sort of excelled at it. And if you look at now some of the sort of Twitter comments coming out from these gang members, I mean, it's literally, the boss is back, #boss. You know, that is a straight quote from it. So if you're progressive Maldivian, you've sort of had this 5-year period of relative openness and relative calm and stability, then you look at this and you very quickly start scrubbing your social media of the last 5 years. There is a real sense of fear and dread that was very evident in the aftermath. I sort of had some Maldivian friends around the other day, and after the election, and they were, you know, shaking. Physically, you know, there is very much a sense that this could backslide somewhere quite unpleasant. Muizzu is kind of a, you know, is he a stopgap? Is he a sort of a speed bump in the road to that process? I mean, it's a long electoral cycle, and a lot can happen. I think the thing to remember was that under Yamin's rule, even though Yamin came to power with the support of all these other groups who turned on the MDP after the coup, he systematically removed everyone who assisted him coming to power, accusing them of traitors, jailing them, forcing them into exile, and in the end was pretty much on his own, which is why perhaps one of the factors why the MDP was able to clean up on him in the 2018 election. But you know, he is absolutely the sort of person who will work to take back control of some of these institutions that have been made much more stable and independent under the MDP. And this would be this would be the thing to watch, I think, the state of judicial reform, whether that starts to go back, the role of the police in terms of cracking down on political gatherings, MDP political activity. It's going to be an interesting few years, but I think the initial 3 months will probably look quite stable.
Our next question is from Sumit Bothra, who asks, do populist promises make an impact in Maldives elections? Mimrah, would you like to chime in on this, or?
Sure. No, and the president found this out to his embarrassment. Both parties in the lead up to the election, they had been making absolutely lavish promises. If I'm elected, I'll raise the pay for civil servants and people working in different sectors. I'll provide you with free real estate, and I'll essentially provide you with money. And no party has had the moral high ground in terms of making these kinds of promises. And it actually made the incumbent government seem quite silly, because back in January this year, they had actually raised the goods and services tax because on the argument that we actually need to become more fiscally responsible because our debt situation is quite bad. And we have an upcoming debt payment of $1 billion, which is approximate to about 1/5 or 1/6 of our GDP that is due in 2026. But on the eve of the election, they put fiscal responsibility to one side and basically just said, no, if you vote for me, I'll raise your pay, I'll provide you real estate, I'll give you money. And beyond these lavish promises, there was also a lot of bribery by both parties, alleged bribery by both parties, which have been documented and reported on social media. But at the end of the day, they haven't really been able to leverage that into votes at the ballot box. I mean, people are happy to accept money and then vote whichever way they were going to vote anyway. So populist promises in terms of in terms of material benefit, they are ineffective. However, populist fear does work. The India Out campaign was very much a populist campaign. And I think the PPM were very effective in leveraging this fear that Maldivians have, that we are becoming excessively subservient to India, into votes at the ballot box. So I think the populist fear factor does work. Populist material incentives simply do not.
JJ, what's your take on this?
I think one way to view it, which has been quite convincingly argued, is that if you look at sort of Maldivian politics of the last 400 years, it's a tussle between about 6 ruling families based in Malé. There is this centralization of political power among a sort of wealthy political elite that often excludes many of the islands, and I guess you would say working class people. So the MDP, to some extent, is an oddity in all of this, because they came in, when they did come in, they came in with the support of these islands, and this mission of sort of decentralizing, building up these islands, which is a very expensive thing to do. If you have to replicate services on every single tiny island of 200 people, it becomes, across 200 islands, it becomes quite a quite a challenging thing. Whereas the sort of PPM model, the Gayoom model, has been to bring that power and centralize it as much in Mali. If you look at the last couple of as far as populist giveaways are concerned, in the last couple of months, in the lead up, 60 days leading up to the election, the MDP had this scheme of reclaimed land in Hulamale, next door to Male, where these plots of land were being handed out, about 12,000 of them, if I believe, to people who you could apply for this land, you could apply for these flats, but you had to have proof that you'd lived in Mali for a certain amount of time. You had to be sort of one of these, at least a 20-year history of having lived in Mali. So if you're someone who's living, say, in Adu or one of these other atolls, you sort of see this centralization of power and wealth, and land, of course, which is enormously precious in a country like the Maldives, which doesn't have that much of it. You sort of see this consolidation and react, quite strongly to that. That was absolutely a factor that flipped many islands against the MDP. As far as populism goes, I mean, I completely agree that this, turning India out into a wedge issue, the sort of level of disinformation as to how active the Indian military is in the country beyond a couple of rescue helicopters. I mean, these are things, this sort of suspicion of outside influence is another thing that's been quite strong and was quite prevalent during Yamin's era. It was always foreign powers are trying to do this, or this person is an agent of this government or that power, that interest. That, along with accusing someone of being anti-Islamic, is a way of discrediting your political opponents. You don't have the interests of the country at heart. You're a sort of a mouthpiece for this, that, or the other. So yes, I think is the answer to that. Populist politics can be quite effective.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is a reminder that the political drama is not over in Maldives, even though the presidential election is. I'm going to paraphrase because I'm trying to squeeze in as many questions as we can, but the parliamentary referendum and the potential that maybe Maldives could move to a system where the prime minister has more power than the president. Is the MDP more likely to support that now that it has lost the presidency? How would the PPM-PNC react, having just won the presidency, to a change of this magnitude? So again, a lot to unpack there. Mimrah, you mentioned this in some of your previous comments, so maybe you can help us untangle the threads.
So the MDP, they have historically supported a parliamentary system of government, but they will not support it this time for the simple reason that they are extremely upset with Mohamed Nasheed, because they blame him for having cost them the presidency. So even out of spite for him, they will not support a parliamentary system of government. They had initially proposed that this referendum would be held on the 30th of October. And I don't think that's either pragmatic or really a responsible thing to do, because essentially you have an opposition candidate that's just won the mandate of the people through a national election. And then to say that, okay, but we're just going to use a constitutional coup, we're going to transition to a parliamentary system and take away all the powers of the presidency and vest it in an MDP legislature, I don't think will be received well. And beyond that, despite Mohamed Nasheed's advocacy for it, his long-standing advocacy, it's both self-serving and also genuine. I believe he's the only sitting president who's ever tried to become a prime minister. Even when he was president, he had proposed this model as a better model for the Maldives, just because of how coalition politics are practiced, and because he feels that it's difficult when the executive and the legislature aren't aligned. But returning to what I was saying, I don't think it would be particularly well received if Muizzu is undercut and his electoral result is essentially rendered moot, and he's elected to a ceremonial presidency, that would not be received well. And as I was saying, beyond Nasheed's advocacy, that there's not a lot of popular support for a parliamentary system of government right now. To be fair, there's not really been a sustained awareness campaign on what a parliamentary system would entail for the Maldives. There have been some good points raised for it. I personally am in favor of a parliamentary system, but there's not really been much engagement with voters. There's not been a sustained education campaign, and it's also an issue of timing. Muizzu has been elected to a 5-year term with the mandate of the people, and it's not. It goes against the spirit of democracy to essentially, again, just render him a ceremonial president right after he's become elected and vest all the powers of the presidency in the prime minister. How this referendum will succeed, or if it will even be on the ballot in the upcoming Majlis or parliamentary elections, that remains a question to be answered. But Nasheed will be advocating for it. And I think Yamin has an incentive to advocate for it, but I don't know if he will actually be a part of that charge as well, because while he has said that he in principle supports a parliamentary system, he has reservations about how it would function in the Maldives as well, because there's not such a thing as a floor crossing legislation in the Maldives, where our parliamentarians, they switch parties as often as they change their clothes. And so even if a party is elected to power and then everyone suddenly starts switching their parties, there's not really much room or scope for stability there. But again, like I said, it remains to be seen what plays and maneuvers that Nasheed and Yamin and the advocates of a parliamentary system will make in the lead up to the Majlis elections.
Go ahead, JJ. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this as well.
I was going to say, if you look at the incentives in this, I mean, a sort of credible, functioning police force, a judicial system that you know is well apart from the executive politics. These are all things that are not necessarily in the interests of someone who's you know just had an 11-year sentence for fraud and corruption and money laundering. I think you can probably see there's a certain level of self-interest that Yamin may have in terms of reclaiming some control over this. One of the key factors that ended up being the undoing of the first Maldives democracy experiment of 2008 was a failure to reform the judicial system. It was the judges and magistrates in the country at that time were political appointees, people who were there with lifetime appointments to protect the interests of the political leadership that had installed them. So when that political leadership suddenly found itself in the regime, suddenly found itself in opposition, they also functioned as a shield to prevent prosecution for various human rights abuses, custodial torture, corruption, fraud. It was impossible to get anything to stick. So one of the key things that the MDP did following, and probably one of the most important things following 2018, was embark upon this program of judicial reform, cleaned up particularly the Supreme Court, introduced a lot more female judges, and especially reformed the judicial watchdog, the JSC. Did it go far enough is probably going to be a question that's going to come up a bit, but this will be one of the main factors that sort of decides whether or not things start to backslide, and also how much room Yamin has to operate as he did previously. I think until that work, those reforms are undone to some extent, he will be possibly a bit more constrained by the political factors. But it's also important, I think, to remember that the Maldives is a very small country physically as well. In Male, you have this incredibly congested capital. It's if someone who, say, is convicted and then mysteriously released for stabbing a journalist, and that person is sort of wandering around, the relatives of the person who's murdered can quite, you sit in the same cafe and this person wanders in, everyone looks quiet and awkward, but you have this kind of the injustice is very much in your face, if what I'm trying to say. It's not a society where it's easy to sort of be anonymous and disappear, and that plays into the level of fear too. People know where you live. People know whose family you're connected to. There's a lot of sort of family connections between people. So that environment can become fractious quite quickly, and something like a killing, it echoes through families, causes sort of turmoil for years and years and years in a society like that that's so close to each other. So in this sense, yeah, I think Yamin has a certain amount of room to operate in at the moment. He's been released to house arrest. No one quite knows what judicial process has led to him going from prison to house arrest, but it seems to have happened. And the assumption now is just that Yamin is free again, but there was a judicial process that put him into prison in the first place, and that seems to be fraying, which I would say for me would be a clear indicator of things going backwards.
All right. Well, Mimrah, JJ, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for listening and for asking such great questions. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we will keep covering Maldives even now that the election is over. As we just noted, there's plenty to pay attention to and to keep watching. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see everyone at the next Diplomat webinar.